April 17, 1943. 26,000 feet above Saint-Nazaire, France, the sky was burning. The thin, frozen air trembled with the roar of engines as 14 B-17 flying fortresses droned toward the French coast in a tight combat box, their aluminum skins shining like drifting shards of the sun. Their contrails stretched across the heavens in long, white scars. Beneath them, invisible from this altitude, German radar stations had already locked on. Jagged arcs of data raced along wires. Phones rang. Command snapped out at the heart of the RAF-controlled French coastline. Luftwaffe fighters began to scramble. Inside one of the American B-17's call sign Ramblin' rose. Every vibration felt like a nail, hammered into the bones of the 10 men aboard. Their oxygen masks hissed with each inhale. The frigid wind whipped through every tiny gap in the metal fuselage. At this altitude, exposed skin would freeze in seconds. The bombardier, Louis Porter, wiped frost from his goggles and peered through the glass nose. All stations, he murmured into the intercom, flak expected in 90 seconds. Up in the top turret, Staff Sergeant John Mills tightened his gloves. Copy that. I see puffs already, and indeed black flowers of death were beginning to bloom. On the German side, the incoming formation was a sight both familiar and deeply frustrating. The B-17 had earned its nickname Flying Fortress for a reason. Fighters had attacked these things with cannons, machine guns, rockets, and still they kept coming. Still they returned home with wings shredded, tails half blown, and entire engines missing, yet somehow refusing to fall. But the Luftwaffe wasn't going to let this raid pass. Not today. 20 miles ahead of the B-17s, Oberleutnant Erich Bremer, an experienced Luftwaffe pilot flying an FW-190A, was climbing through the cloud layer. His squadron had been briefed about this formation, 2 fortresses heading inland, escorted halfway by P-47s, then alone for the final run. Attempting target, Bremer was no rookie. He had already shot down Soviet P-2 bombers near Smolensk and had dueled RAF Spitfires over the English Channel. But the Americans, they were something different. Through his canopy, he spotted the first glints of aluminum tiny sparks on the horizon. Formation ahead. Angels 26, he radioed calmly. Command confirmed. Engage with vertical diving attacks. Concentrate on tail elements. Bremer's fingers tightened on the stick. The B-17s reached the flak zone. The sky detonated. A wall of explosions rose to meet them, black, boiling shrapnel tearing at the air. Each burst shook the bombers violently, as if giants were slamming hammers against their wings. In the waist gun positions, American gunners pressed themselves against the bulkheads, praying the next hit wouldn't tear through the fuselage. On Ramblin' Rose, an explosion erupted just beneath the right wing, spraying the skin with splinters. Direct hit near the No. 3 engine. Mills yelled. The aircraft lurched, dropping dozens of feet before the pilot wrestled it back into formation. But the fortresses held the line. To the German gunners watching from below, it was infuriating. This machine, this fortress, refused to die. Inside his FW-190 cockpit, Bremer watched the carnage with a cold, analytical gaze. Flak alone wasn't enough. It never was. The Americans had built something brutally stubborn, a bomber that absorbed punishment like a battleship. Prepare for the dive, he told his wingmen. They pushed their noses down. The world tilted into a steep attack angle, engines screaming as gravity pulled them toward the formation. The B-17 defensive gunners opened fire instantly. Tracer rounds carved glowing lines through the sky. The air was so thick with metal it seemed impossible for anything to fly through it. Bremer's fighters shook as bullets whipped past the canopy. He fired a burst from his 20mm MG-151 cannons, violent, rapid flashes shuddering through his wings. His target, a trailing fortress, erupted in sparks. He saw metal peel away. He saw an engine flame out. He saw a gunner slump in his window. But the bomber did not fall. It kept flying. Bremer's jaw tightened. He banked for another pass. The Americans inside the B-17 were fighting for their lives. Mills shouted, "Fighter at 6 o'clock low." Waist gunners scrambled to fire. Brass casings clattered across the floor. The air was deafening, guns slamming, oxygen hissing, metal cracking, engines burning. Louis Porter felt the entire ship tremble as cannon shells punched through the fuselage. He braced himself and whispered, "Hold together, girl. Just hold." But the formation still held. Still flying, still moving forward. Behind them, Bremer climbed for another attack run, sweat stinging his eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The bombers were riddled with holes, hundreds of impacts, shredded control surfaces, shattered glass, and yet they refused to die. For the first time that morning, a thought formed in his mind: our tactics aren't enough anymore. Not against this. The Flying Fortress had earned its name, and this was only the beginning. 26,000 feet over the Loire River Basin, Franchette, the air battle deepened into pure chaos. Oberleutnant Bremer pulled his FW-190A back into a climbing arc, his engine howling as he banked left through a swirl of smoke and tracer fire. His first pass had been textbook sharp fast, aggressive, and still the American bomber had refused to break apart. It should have spiraled down in flames. Instead, it had closed ranks and held formation, wings trembling, but unwavering. Ahead of him, the B-17s lumbered on, climbing slowly toward their target area. Their formation, a tight, box-like structure, was working exactly as intended. Each bomber supported the next with overlapping fields of fire. It was, in every way, a flying fortress. Over the radio, German voices crackled with disbelief. "Hit it again. It's still flying. My cannons emptied, no effect. A giant hole in its wing. But it won't go down." Bremer exhaled sharply. He toggled his weapon selector, switching from cannon to machine guns for a faster firing rate. His wingman, Feldwebel-Kappel, pulled alongside him, sweat streaking down his forehead inside the mask. "This is insane, Herr Oberleutnant. I saw one with its tail nearly severed still keeping formation." Bremer nodded grimly. "We will break them. We must." But even he didn't believe his own words anymore. The American formation regroups inside Ramblin' Rose. The pilot, Captain Alan Brooks, fought the controls with white-knuckled tension. Shrapnel had ripped through his right wing. Engine 3 was coughing dark smoke. The oxygen feed to the tail gunner had been cut. Still, they flew. Still, they stayed in formation. Brooks shouted over the intercom, "Gunners, keep those fighters off us. Hold tight, bomb run in 3 minutes." From the top turret, Mills could see B-17s bleeding aluminum flakes like silver snow. One bomber had lost its entire nose cone, the plexiglass blown away by a direct hit. The bombardier inside clung to his mount with numb fingers, the slipstream slashing his face with freezing, invisible knives. Yet that bomber, half exposed to the sky, refused to drop out. The Americans knew one truth: fall out of formation, and you die alone. So they held. Bremer's second attack run from above. Bremer rolled into another dive. His altimeter spun downward as he powered toward the formation again, the air vibrating from the shock of his rapid descent. He lined up a bomber already pockmarked with holes, the same one he had wounded earlier. He fired .20mm shells burst against its fuselage like miniature grenades. Panels tore away. The tail shuddered violently, still flying. Bremer cursed under his breath. Another burst, more sparks, more damage. Still flying. Through his gun sight, he saw American gunners firing back with unbelievable determination, even through shattered, frozen windows. He banked hard to avoid the incoming tracers that snapped past his wings like flaming teeth. His wingman shouted, "They're absorbing everything we have." Bremer breathed heavily, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. He could feel the realization taking shape like a cold weight in his stomach. Our standard tactics are failing. Inside the fortress, meanwhile, inside Ramblin' Rose, chaos took a different form. The radio operator screamed, "Left waist gun jammed. Get it cleared. They're coming in again." The waist gunner, Private Cole Barrett, fought to unjam his Browning .50 caliber. The bolt was frozen, his fingers numb. Blood dripped from a cut on his chin he hadn't even noticed. His world was a tunnel of noise, metal groaning, bullets striking the fuselage like a hailstorm of steel, the overpowering smell of gunpowder mixing with freezing oxygen. Barrett finally yanked the bolt free and fired a wild burst at a diving FW-190. He didn't hit anything. He didn't care. He had to keep shooting. Mills in the top turret yelled, "Fighter climbing at 5 o'clock. Watch your tail." Every man aboard the B-17 knew what was at stake. They had heard stories, horror stories, about what happened when a bomber went down over France. If they parachuted, they faced capture or worse. If they stayed in the plane and it broke apart, no one wanted to think about that. So they held the line. Every bullet they fired was a prayer for one more minute of life. The Luftwaffe begins to doubt. Bremer climbed again, his engine overheating from repeated dives. His frustration was contagious, spread through every German pilot in the sector. These Americans, they will not fall. The bomber must have armor everywhere. We need heavier guns. This is useless. Bremer checked his ammunition. Half gone. His squadron leader barked, "Third attack run, prepare." But he hesitated. Not out of fear. Bremer was no coward, but out of confusion, out of disbelief, out of an emerging, unavoidable truth. The Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter. They were becoming the hunted. He saw an engine torn open, a tail shredded, armor plates peeled like tinfoil land. The bombers flew on, still steady, still advancing, still refusing to die. Bremer swallowed hard. This shouldn't be possible, he whispered to himself. Yet it was happening before his eyes. Toward the bomb run ahead of the formation, the dark silhouette of the submarine pens came into view. The B-17s tightened their formation and prepared to drop. Despite the carnage, despite the damage, despite losing to aircraft already, the rest were going through. Bremer swung around for another pass. But a flicker of fear crept into his mind, fear of the machine that refused to fall, fear that the war in the sky was shifting, and fear that this day would forever change Luftwaffe doctrine. 26.0 feet over St. Nazaire submarine pen's final stretch toward the target was always the most dangerous, always the longest, always the moment when every man aboard a B-17 felt time stretching thin and life stretching thinner. Captain Brooks steadied Ramblin' Rose as the vast concrete submarine pens came into view. Through the drifting smoke, they looked like giant slabs of stone rising from the coastline, thick, reinforced, and deadly. The Germans had built them to be bomb-proof, but the U.S. 8th Air Force intended to test that theory every chance it got. Bombardier. Brooks called out, "You're on." Lewis Porter crawled into position, gripping the Norden bomb sight. His fingers shook not from fear, but from cold and exhaustion. He peered down through the shattered plexiglass nose, wind roaring against his mask, and took control of the aircraft's final approach. Steady. Steady, he whispered. The entire formation flattened and locked into the bombing run. No evasive maneuvers now. No weaving. No swerving. They were frozen in place, giant, lumbering targets for anything with a gun and hatred of the American star. The Luftwaffe senses the momentum above and closing fast. Oberleutnant Bremer spotted the change immediately. "They're committing," he announced over radio. "This is their bomb run. They cannot maneuver." His wingman replied with a sharp, eager tone, "Then we strike now." But Bremer didn't reply. Something inside him resisted that old confidence. It looked at the formation well of remaining B-17s, each scarred and battered, each leaking smoke and debris. Yet they were still in perfect alignment, still flying, still pushing forward, still impossible to knock down. He rolled into another dive, but hesitated as he watched the bombers defy the logic of air combat. The wounded aircraft should have fallen apart. The tail-damaged one should have spun into the sea long ago. The one missing half its nose should have been claimed by the slipstream within seconds. But no, they stayed. And Bremer realized he was flying into a new kind of war, one his training had not prepared him for. Inside the B-17, silence. Before impact for a moment, the gunfire ceased. The crew inside Ramblin' Rose could hear their own breathing again, deep, shaky, grateful. Then Porter's voice broke the short silence. Bomb bay doors opened. The hydraulic valves hissed. Cold air rushed upward through the long metal belly of the bomber. The aircraft's drag increased instantly, and Brooks felt the controls strain. Doors open. The engineer repeated, "Ready, ready." Porter muttered, adjusting the CROSSHAIRS. All around them, other B-17s opened their bomb bays in unison. The sky glittered as dozens of metallic doors swung down like the wings of mechanical birds preparing to strike. Then the flak intensified. The Germans realized they had only seconds left to stop the bomb run. A storm of steel. Sky exploded again, heavier, closer, angrier. Black clouds of flak burst around the formation, shaking the bombers violently. A shockwave slammed through Ramblin' Rose, shoving Porter into the bomb site. His teeth rattled. The intercom screeched with static. "Flak, 12 o'clock. Hit on the lead bomber. Engine fire on 274. Hold steady. Do not break formation." Porter wiped frost from the bomb site, fighting the sting in his eyes. He could barely see the target through the smoke. Closing. Closing. Almost. Another flak burst tore through the left wing of a nearby B-17, ripping away an entire section of the aileron. The bomber sagged, dipped, struggled, but the pilot forced it upward, clawing his way back into the group. Bremer witnessed this from above and felt a chill run down his spine. How are they still flying? His goggles reflected the endless barrage black burst of flak, tracer rounds, metal fragments tearing through the air, and yet the American formation held its shape, as if bound by some invisible will. Release. Porter's voice dropped to a whisper. Bombs. Away. He hit the release. A dozen cylindrical bombs fell from Ramblin' Rose, tumbling gracefully before plummeting toward the submarine pens. Moments later, the rest of the formation followed suit, releasing tons of explosive payload. The reduction in weight lifted the B-17 slightly, and immediate relief felt throughout the airframe. Bombs. Away echoed through every intercom in the formation. The crew let out a collective breath, but the danger had only begun to shift. Bremer's moment of truth. Luftwaffe fighters dove through the gaps between bombers, trying to score final kills before the Americans turned back toward the channel. The sky was a labyrinth of contrails, falling bombs, flak burst, and tracer fire. Bremer lined up Ramblin' Rose again. He squeezed the trigger, His 20mm cannon spat fire. Shells slammed into the B-17's fuselage, tearing open new wounds holes the size of fist. Sparks vomiting from the skin dot inside the bomber. Mills shouted, right side hit. Fuel leak starting. But the B-17 kept flying. Still alive. Still holding formation. Still obeying the ancient, stubborn will of its crew. Bremer watched in disbelief. He had fired into the same bomber 3 times. Hit it repeatedly. Damaged it to the brink of collapse. And yet, there it was. Steady. Unbroken. Advancing through hell like a steel ghost. Bremer finally said the words he had avoided all morning. Our tactics are useless. These machines are built to survive anything. It was the moment the Luftwaffe began to understand. This wasn't a bomber they could scare. This wasn't a bomber they could bully. This was a flying fortress. 26,000 feet, turning west toward the channel when the last bombs fell. The B-17 formation banked toward home like wounded giants struggling back to their lair. Some trailed fire. Some leaked fuel in shimmering streams. One had a hole the size of a kitchen door torn clean through its fuselage. And yet they flew. Inside their cockpits, American pilots steadied trembling hands against the controls. The bomb run had gone through. But the Luftwaffe was far from finished. The flight home was often deadlier than the approach. Captain Brooks exhaled slowly, feeling sweat freeze at the edges of his oxygen mask. All right, boys, he said, voice rough from cold and adrenaline. Let's bring her home. The crew responded with tired acknowledgement. They were alive. For now, the Luftwaffe regroups for a final assault above them. The German fighters arsed into new formations, regrouping for the next strike. They had to catch the B-17s before they reached the protective umbrella of RAF escorts. Over the channel. Bremer leveled his FW-198 and checked his ammunition, only a few bursts left. His wingman, Kappel, was in the same situation. Herr Oberleutnant Kappel said over the radio, "We've hit them with everything. They just keep flying. What are these things made of?" Bremer didn't answer at first. His mind was elsewhere, on the shattered bomber he had attacked repeatedly, on its stubborn insistence on survival, on the sheer engineering madness of building something so durable. Finally, he replied, "They're made of rivets, steel, and men who won't die." He took a long, steady breath, and Berlin expects us to match that with planes made for speed, not survival. It was the first time he had openly acknowledged the truth forming in every German pilot's mind. Inside the fortress, holding the Lineth return flight, was Agony. And Ramblin' Rose, the tail gunner, Private Sam Harper, fought to stay conscious. His oxygen line had been severed earlier by shrapnel. Now, wrapped in emergency tubing and rationed oxygen, he breathed shallow, desperate pulls. "Hang on, Sam," the radio operator told him, kneeling beside the gunner's blister. "We're almost home." Harper nodded weakly, eyes glassy from hypoxia. He couldn't speak, not with the temperature dropping and the pain in his lungs burning like fire. Meanwhile, the waist gunners monitored the skies as the bomber shuddered from turbulence and structural damage. "Barrett, the left waist gunner, whispered, if one rivet pops loose, I swear the whole tail's going to snap off." Still, he stood at his post. Still, he looked for enemy fighters with his half-frozen eyes. Still, he kept his finger near the trigger. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because every man on that bomber depended on him not to fail. The Luftwaffe's last attempt. Bremer and Kappel dove one more time. The sun glared against their canopies. The air thinned. Their fuel gauges dropped dangerously low. But they pressed on. Honor demanded it. Training demanded it. Pride demanded it. Bremer locked onto a damaged B-17 whose left horizontal stabilizer was nearly gone. He fired a burst of 20mm shells. His last. One shell exploded near an engine. Another tore a hole in the wing. One slammed into the waist section, shaking the bomber violently. But still it did not fall. Bremer pulled alongside the bomber for a split second, just long enough to see the faces inside. He saw the top turret gunner, Mills, tracking him with exhausted determination. He saw the pilot steadying the controls with a bloodied hand. He saw a waist gunner, barely visible through shattered glass, continuing to fire burst from his Browning. They were ghost in a metal coffin, refusing to give up. And Bremer understood something profound. These men weren't fighting to win. They were fighting to live long enough to make it home. He pulled away, shaken. Running on empty, Luftwaffe pilots soon faced their own enemy, fuel. Bremer. "Command says break off," the radio blared. "Return to base immediately." Kappel added reluctantly, "We can't chase them across the coast." Bremer clenched his jaw. He looked at the formation of battered B-17 slipping farther west. He whispered softly, almost respectfully, "Go home, you stubborn fortresses." Then he turned his fighter toward the airfield, knowing he had witnessed something that would change German air doctrine forever. The Americans crossed the coastline when the first glimpse of the channel appeared beneath the clouds. The crew of Ramblin' Rose erupted into exhausted cheers. Land. I see land. Oh, thank God. Hold together, Rosie. Just a little farther. Minutes later, they saw them, the silver shapes of P-47 Thunderbolts sweeping in like guardian angels, escorts. Mills shouted, "We've got escorts." The relief was immediate, palpable, overwhelming. Brooks allowed himself a small smile. "Welcome back, boys." The Thunderbolts formed a protective ring, driving off the last scattered FW-190s still circling from a distance. The Luftwaffe turned away the second they saw American fighters approaching. The balance of the skies had shifted. The realization takes root as Ramblin' Rose limped toward England. Brooks finally spoke the words carried by every B-17 crew that survived days like these. We shouldn't be alive, but they were. Because the B-17 wasn't just a bomber, it was a steel promise. A promise that if its crew fought with everything they had, the Fortress would fight with them. And across the channel, in the cockpit of his returning FW-190, Oberleutnant Bremer replayed the battle over and over. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. The Luftwaffe's methods no longer worked. Their tactics had failed. The Flying Fortress had changed the war. RAV-based Southern England, the runway lights flickered beneath drifting fog. As Ramblin' Rose approached the airfield, limping like a wounded leviathan returning from a world of fire, ground crews rushed outside. The moment they saw the bomber silhouette, its jagged hulls, shredded aluminum skin, and smoke trailing from multiple engines, Captain Brooks guided the B-17 down with the delicacy of a surgeon. Though every fiber of the aircraft creaked in protest, tires screeched on touchdown. The bomber bounced once, twice, then settled into a long, shaky roll. Inside, the crew remained silent. No one spoke until the aircraft finally stopped. Then, as if a spell broke, they exhaled, some laughing with relief, some crying quietly behind oxygen masks, some simply staring into space, overwhelmed that the nightmare was over. The hatch opened. Cold English air rushed in. Medics climbed aboard first. They found Sam Harper, the tail gunner, barely conscious but alive. Waist gunner Barrett leaned against the fuselage, trembling uncontrollably. Porter wiped blood from his forehead only to discover the cut was shallow. He simply hadn't felt it. During the chaos, each man walked down the ladder battered but breathing. Behind them, the Ramblin' Rose stood like a testament to madness, an aircraft torn nearly to ribbons, but one that never surrendered an inch of sky. The engineer's shock moment. The ground crew inspected the B-17. Their jaws dropped. A mechanic pointed to a jagged hole torn through the right wing. If this shear point had extended to inches more, he whispered, the entire wing would have come off. Another crawled beneath the fuselage. There's a fuel line completely severed, but the backup valve kept it stable. Someone else found a 20mm shell embedded in a rib near the radio compartment, unexploded. Another found a fist-sized hole punched through the bomb bay frame. By the time they finished logging the damage, one engineer muttered, any other aircraft would be scrap metal. But the B-17 was built differently, designed differently, created with one purpose: get the crew home. No matter how much steel it had to bleed along the way. The debriefing hours later, Captain Brooks and his crew sat in a sparse briefing room sipping lukewarm coffee, still shaking from adrenaline. Officers gathered around a large map, marking the bomber stream's route. How many returned? Brooks asked. 12. The intelligence officer replied. 2 went down over the target area, and 1 was forced to ditch in the channel. Brooks closed his eyes for a moment. He could see the fallen aircraft clearly, the ones spinning downward, trailing fire, the ones that never pulled up from the flak burst, the ones taken apart by concentrated cannon fire. The officer added softly, but because of you and the others, the submarine pens took significant damage. Brooks nodded, but he wasn't thinking about victory. He was thinking about survival, about how close death had come, about the machine that delivered them back to English soil despite everything thrown at it. Across the channel, a very different debriefing at a Luftwaffe base on the French coast. Oberleutnant Erich Bremer removed his leather gloves with trembling hands. His FW-190 sat behind him, its ammunition stores nearly empty, its engine overheated from repeated dives. Inside the briefing room, the atmosphere was strained, not triumphant, not angry, but unsettled. Bremer stood before a map dotted with pins marking B-17 formations. A senior officer demanded, "Why did so many escape?" Bremer's jaw tightened. He wanted to answer diplomatically, politely, but exhaustion stripped away caution. Because, Herr Major, he said slowly, our tactics are outdated. The room went silent. Bremer continued, voice steady. We dive. We fire burst from our 20mm cannons. We pull away. The Americans absorb the damage. We attack again, and again, And still they fly. He pointed to a symbol representing the B-17s. These machines are not like the Soviet bombers on the Eastern Front. They are faster, heavily armored, armed everywhere. Their formations overlap in a way we cannot break without unacceptable losses. The senior officer frowned. Are you suggesting we cannot defeat them? Bremer looked him directly in the eye. I am suggesting, he replied, that the Luftwaffe must change, or we will lose the air war. It was the most dangerous truth a German officer could speak in 1943, but it was the truth nonetheless. A war-shifting consequence in the weeks that followed. The Luftwaffe began experimenting with new tactics, frontal attacks the most dangerous, but most effective. Gun upgrades from 20mm to 30mm cannons, rocket-based interception to tear-apart bomber formations, heavily armored sternback, FW-190s built specifically to ram, or cripple B-17s. These changes were direct responses to pilots like Bremer, who reported what they saw. The flying fortress was nearly impossible to bring down using old methods, but even with new tactics, even with heavier guns and suicidal bravery, the Luftwaffe could not reverse the tide. American bombers kept coming, more of them every month. And every time, German pilots remembered days like the one over Saint Nazaire, when they hit a B-17 hundreds of times and watched it keep flying. The legacy of the flying fortress back in England. Ramblin' Rose was hauled into a repair hangar. Dozens of workers crowded around her, examining the unbelievable damage. Brooks and his crew stood beneath the bomber one last time before walking to their quarters. The aircraft looked like a steel skeleton barely held together by luck and willpower. She shouldn't be here, Mills said quietly, but she was. Because the flying fortress was more than a bomber, more than a machine of steel and rivets. It was a lifeline, a guardian, a symbol carved into the sky with sweat, courage, and impossible engineering. And on that day, April 17th, 1943, both the Americans and the Luftwaffe learned something that would echo through the rest of the war. The B-17 flying fortress was not just hard to kill. It was redefining the very nature of air combat.